I'm Chris Sims.
And I'm Todd McKay.
This is the Canadian Taxpayers Podcast. We're dedicated to lower taxes, less waste, and more accountable government. In this episode, we're going to take a deep dive into Alberta's equalization fight. That province is tired of being bled of its wealth, and they're going to have a referendum about it. And in Waste Watch, we'll tell you all about the Prime Minister's failed campaign to get a seat at the United Nations Security Council.
But first, we want to know what all of the Conservative leadership candidates think about carbon taxes. So the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, right from day one with the carbon tax, we were like, nope, this isn't going to work. It's going to cost a lot of money. It's not going to help the environment. And if anybody wants to be Prime Minister, we want to talk to them about what they think about axing the carbon tax.
For sure. This is a really key issue for Conservative Party members. Anybody that's ever listened in on one of their big forums, anytime that the carbon tax comes up, it's a really hot topic. So let's hear what the candidates have said about it so far.
I think it's very important that as Conservatives, we are clear and unequivocal about our opposition to the carbon tax, the Trudeau carbon tax. I certainly am. Having represented a rural riding in Nova Scotia, I know that this is an unfair tax. And by the way, it's not a plan.
Yes, I do agree to scrap the carbon tax because I believe that it's extremely punitive, especially on lower income families and some of the most vulnerable sectors, our agricultural sector, our dairy sector, our farming sector. And so I believe that we should scrap the individual's carbon tax.
So I actually have a plan to scrap the tax, so I'm happy to sign this right away. It's been my position consistently, and to work with the provinces and collaborate on their plans to get emissions down.
I'm the only candidate who is not only against a carbon tax, but against the Paris Accord, which provides the ideological justification for a carbon tax.
So that was Peter MacKay, Leslyn Lewis, Aaron O'Toole, and Derek Sloan, all speaking about the carbon tax.
And this is where the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we like to step it up a notch. Because we all listen to politicians, we hear what they're saying, and they'll all tell us what we want to hear, but are they going to actually do what they say they're going to do? So here at the Taxpayers Federation, we like to take those politicians who make those big promises and make them sign a pledge. Put your name on the dotted line. That way, everybody remembers exactly what they promised. It's what we did with the Ontario election. The progressive Conservative leadership candidates in Ontario, they all signed our pledge to get rid of the carbon tax. Of course, Premier Doug Ford won that contest, and he went on to get rid of the carbon tax in Ontario. It was a big deal because obviously if you get all of the candidates to agree to something, you got pretty good odds that somebody's going to come out of that with that kind of policy initiative in mind. But it also means that they've got support in caucus and in cabinet to move that stuff through. It worked well in Ontario. We're pushing the same play on the federal level.
And if politicians don't keep that promise that they signed their name to, we still hold them accountable. We do so in the media because we have a mascot here at the Taxpayers. His name is Fibber. He has a long nose, looks a lot like a wooden marionette. When politicians break their promises, we bring him along to their public events so he can remind them that they fibbed. We did that most recently in the last election with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau when he said he would balance the budget, and he obviously did not. Politicians really don't like to see Fibber chasing them around.
Yeah, Prime Minister was looking out the campaign bus and seeing Fibber waving at him a lot of times in the last election. He should have got that budget balanced like he said he was going to. But in this case, on the carbon tax pledge, the federal Conservative leadership candidates all signed on the dotted line last week with the Taxpayers Federation. And the pledge reads like this, quote, "I promise that if elected Prime Minister, I will immediately repeal the Trudeau carbon tax and reject any future national carbon tax or cap and trade scheme." We've got the photos, we've got the videos, they're going to be all over social media. We're going to keep those. We don't lose them. If there's ever a problem with this promise, we'll bring them back up. But listen, we've got them on this one. They promised to get rid of the carbon tax immediately. Make sure that a new one doesn't come up. There's no gray area on this.
It's a good thing that we're fighting the carbon tax because when you look at it, there's no shortage of people pushing for higher taxes.
Yeah, that's really true. So we've been campaigning against the carbon tax right from the start. We fight hard in the media, and that's really important. But we've gone to court as well. In fact, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation is the only advocacy group fighting on behalf of taxpayers at these court hearings. On the other side, there are dozens of groups weighing in, fighting for higher carbon taxes. We've got the David Suzuki Foundation, Eco Justice, lots of others bringing their big legal teams with their big deep-pocketed donors. On the other side, in terms of third-party advocacy groups, there's us. That's it. And if you want to join the fight against the carbon tax, head on over to taxpayer.com.
Coming up next, Todd's going to take a deep dive into equalization with Franco and explain how Alberta is finally fighting back. Stay with us.
It's time for a deep dive. This is where we get deeper into important issues. We've got Franco Terrazzano here. He's our Alberta director. Franco, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, I've got something big. Alberta's Fair Deal panel just recommended that the Alberta Premier Jason Kenney hold a referendum on equalization. And Premier Kenney immediately agreed, so Albertans will get a referendum on equalization next year. Here's a clip from Premier Kenney.
Albertans have broadly a deep sense of unfairness about how equalization and the whole system of federal transfers work. We have contributed over $630 billion more to Ottawa and the rest of the provinces than we've received back in benefits or services since about 1960. And even during some really tough economic times here, we continue to make a net contribution of about $20 billion a year, by far more than any other province. Ontario, which had a few years as a so-called have-not province, a net beneficiary, is only making a net contribution of $13 billion, and they have almost 4 times our population. And so what Albertans say is, how can this be the case even when we've been through, in a 5-year economic trough, we've been running massive deficits, while Quebec, for example, that receives about $13 billion in equalization, has been running huge surpluses and has enjoyed 5 years of economic growth. Where is the fundamental fairness, the equity in that? And that's what Albertans want to be able to speak to.
Wow, that does sound big.
Oh, it is. It's a huge win for taxpayers in Alberta. The panel says voters here should have the right to vote on this question. And I quote, "Do you support the removal of Section 36, which deals with the principle of equalization from the Constitution Act 1982? It's a good bet that a lot of Albertans would vote yes to taking equalization out of the Constitution, and that would create a huge opportunity for reforming the program, and it could have massive implications for taxpayers across the country."
Yeah, it definitely could, but maybe we better take a step back first. Can you explain a little bit about equalization? What does it do? What's the problem with it? And why should taxpayers care about it?
Oh, absolutely. Well, equalization was first introduced in the 1950s, and the federal government uses equalization to transfer money to provincial governments in lower income provinces in hopes that they can provide a similar level of services as wealthier provinces.
It sounds like the kind of recipe full of good intentions and bad results.
Well, that's exactly it. Equalization proves that just because a policy sounds nice, it doesn't mean it'll actually work. I mean, first, it really harms taxpayers in provinces who pay into the program but don't receive any of the money. Former Alberta Finance Minister Ted Morton, well, he estimated that the equalization costs Alberta taxpayers about $3 billion annually, but it gets worse.
Yeah, and that's a little scary, because when it gets worse than $3 billion a year, that makes you really worry about what's below the tip of the iceberg.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Because through equalization, taxpayers in wealthier provinces like Alberta directly subsidize politicians who are roadblocking our development. Quebec gets the most from equalization, about $13 billion per year. But the Quebec premier said he doesn't want more oil pipelines from Alberta, and he even went as far as to call Alberta's oil dirty energy. Yet Quebec cashes the equalization checks. So, how is that fair for taxpayers who are paying into the program?
Definitely doesn't seem fair for Albertans. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say that they're going to have something to say about that at the ballot box when they get to that referendum. But tell us how this looks in other provinces.
Well, it can change year over year, but the equalization payers last year were Alberta, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Ontario, Newfoundland, and Labrador. So those were the provinces where taxpayers were paying for the program through their taxes, but weren't receiving any equalization dollars back.
Okay, so I can understand how equalization is a bad deal if you're doing the paying and not doing any of the cashing the checks. But tell us why it's bad for the provinces who get the money.
Well, politicians in those provinces are able to get away with bad policies because they can rely less on growing their economies and rely more on those equalization dollars. For example, Quebec has between $68 billion and $186 billion worth of natural gas in the St. Lawrence Valley. But if Quebec were to develop those resources, it would lose out on some of the equalization money. Pauline Marois, former Parti Quebec premier, summed it up nicely. This is what she said. If one day we produce oil and gas in Quebec, why would we let half of this wealth go down the road to Ottawa?
Wow, it seems like Quebec's leaving a lot of money on the table when it comes to developing its resources. And of course, that's not just cash, it's also jobs. It's also building communities. Are there any other negative impacts from equalization?
Well, again, it gets worse. Equalization also creates incentives for higher taxes, and that harms businesses and workers in those equalization receiving provinces. And that's because higher tax rates reduce the tax base, and that triggers higher equalization payments. You know me, Todd. I think competition on the market, in the marketplace, is great. But competition between governments to provide good governance may be even greater. But equalization reduces that competition by subsidizing poor governance and bad policies. So rather than having to grow the economy to provide government services, which then attracts and retains its citizens, politicians can rely on equalization payments to cover the bills.
Okay, so there are obviously a lot of issues with equalization. Honestly, equalization, especially out west here, it's become kind of like the weather. Everybody complains about it, but nobody does anything about it. But that's about to change. Because Alberta Premier Jason Kenney, he says he's going to hold a referendum on equalization. That's the big victory you came with here. Tell us why that's such a big deal.
Well, it is a big deal, and that's because the Supreme Court's decision on Quebec's separation referendum in the 90s had big implications. Now, a provincial referendum on a constitutional issue, such as equalization, that results on a clear majority on a clear question, forces the feds and the provinces to the negotiating table. So a referendum is just a first step, but it is a crucial first step because we need to take on that unfair equalization program and get everyone in the same room to discuss the needed reforms.
Now, it's easy to be cynical about equalization, but forcing that renegotiation, that's a big deal. So even after Saskatchewan and Alberta raised major concerns about equalization over the last number of years, Federal Finance Minister Bill Morneau, he extended it for 5 years. He added billions of dollars to the equalization bill, and he did it in a footnote in the budget. Not a budget line, not a press release, nothing. Just a footnote extended for 5 years and billions of dollars. That's the kind of thing that just isn't good enough anymore. We have to do better. And when you send millions of people to the ballot box to have their say on it, it can push things forward. That's why a referendum is so important.
And you know what? There really is a reason for hope here. Obviously, Alberta is getting serious about actually doing something about equalization. We're finally leaving the sidelines and actually entering the game. And for Albertans, Saskatchewan is a natural ally. Newfoundland and Labrador has big concerns about equalization because even though its economy is devastated, it's still paying into equalization and getting nothing back. British Columbia and Ontario have traditionally been quiet about equalization, but a negotiation will bring out the fact that those provinces have been stuck with big equalization bills too.
And it makes sense that the provinces who do the paying will have concerns about equalization, but there's some reason to hope for the provinces that get the cash that they're going to look for some change as well. So New Brunswick Premier Blaine Higgs, he says he wants to get his province off of equalization. And he says shrinking equalization would actually be good for recipient provinces because it would motivate them to develop their own economies. And it would make them think twice about blocking big projects like pipelines. Here's what Premier Higgs told CBC about provinces who rely on equalization. Quote, they don't feel anything. So they can just say, no, we're not allowing anything through our province, but we'll take the money. I just don't think that's fair. That's what Premier Higgs said from New Brunswick. But here's one that's even more fascinating. So Quebec is the biggest single recipient of equalization, and it wants to change that. Here's what Premier François Legault told iPolitics about collecting equalization checks. Quote, "It's embarrassing. It can't be solved overnight, but we have to start." Listen, if Quebec's willing to rethink equalization, there's a real opportunity for reform. So what kind of changes should we be looking for?
The key is to start shrinking the size of the equalization pie. And right now it's about $20 billion, and it has skyrocketed in size. Since the program's inception, it has increased by more than 14,000%. And the equalization program is still set to increase every year going forward.
Okay, I think we got to pause for a second here. I think we got to repeat that number. Did you just say equalization has grown by 14,000%?
That's correct. That's correct. It's grown by more than 14,000% since its inception in the late 1950s. And you know what? For all of this money, the experts can't even say for sure if the program is helping. Because a key problem with equalization is that you can't just improve government and services by throwing more taxpayer dollars at the problem. And Alberta is a perfect example of that, of how more taxpayer dollars doesn't mean better services. Look at Alberta and healthcare. We spend a ton of money on the government healthcare system. Alberta spends the second most per person on healthcare in Canada. But Alberta's healthcare doesn't get the best results.
Yeah, I've got another important point on that. I'm actually from Saskatchewan. I'm here in Moose Jaw right now. And equalization is frustrating here because it takes a lot of money out of the province. But I remember when Saskatchewan used to get equalization money, and that was even worse. It was a disincentive to build the economy. It left a sense of dependency. And I definitely never want to go back to a spot where Saskatchewan is collecting equalization handouts. But I want to get back to the referendum that Premier Kenney is planning to hold. And Canadian Taxpayers Federation supporters actually deserve a lot of credit in this situation. Tell us about that.
Well, that's absolutely correct. Our Canadian Taxpayers Federation supporters deserve a ton of kudos on this one, because when Alberta first launched its Fair Deal panel, the government gave it a mandate to find ways to strengthen the province's position within Canada, but it left out equalization. Specifically, it left out the equalization referendum. And that makes absolutely no sense. That's, trying to get a fair deal for Alberta without going after equalization is like hitting a baseball and then running straight to second base without even glancing at first. But then we knew we had to make sure equalization was a pivotal part of the Fair Deal panel's final report. So we sent out a ton of action update emails to our supporters, and we asked them, to tell the government that there's no way for Alberta to get a fair deal without tackling equalization. And when the report came out, its biggest recommendation was reforming equalization. And then almost immediately, Premier Kenney reaffirmed his commitment to holding that equalization referendum. So as it stands right now, next year, Albertans will get their say on equalization at the ballot box, and our supporters deserve a ton of credit for making that happen.
Hi, I'm Scott Hennig, President of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Sorry for interrupting the podcast, but I wanted to take a few seconds of your time to tell you more about the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. We are 235,000 Canadians from coast to coast that are fed up. We are fed up with politicians taking too much out of our paychecks, often to waste it on a bunch of pet projects, corporate welfare, and pork barreling to buy votes. We organize campaigns to push back on these politicians. These campaigns often include petition drives, billboards, media stunts, and more. But most importantly, they ask our supporters to pitch in and take action. Alone, we're a voice in the wilderness. Together, we're an army to be reckoned with. You can join the fight and sign up at no cost at taxpayer.com. That website again is taxpayer.com. Okay, now back to the podcast.
It's time for Waste Watch. This is when we make fun of dumb things that governments are spending your money on. Todd, what do you have for us today?
So Prime Minister Justin Trudeau just lost his campaign to get Canada a seat at the United Nations Security Council, and he lost badly. Both Norway and Ireland just hammered us. It wasn't close. And if only somebody had been there, months ago to say, you know what, maybe this is stupid. Maybe this is a bad idea. Maybe we should just leave this alone. If only there had been somebody to warn the Prime Minister about this.
Oh, we warned him. Our federal director, Aaron Woodrick, published a column in the National Post. Here's the headline, quote, "Millions of dollars for seedy gifts and trips isn't worth it for Canada to get a useless UN Security Council seat," end quote. Think we made it pretty darn clear that this was a really dumb idea.
Yeah, Aaron didn't leave very much gray area there. That just the headline alone pretty much hammers the point that this was a dumb idea. But now we're getting more information about this. The BBC is reporting that Canada spent about $1.7 million on the campaign. And look, I'm going to say it right now. I'm going to make a bold prediction. The final bill is going to come in above that. There's no doubt in my mind. And our investigative reporter, James Wood, he's digging into the cost of this debacle. It's going to take a few months to get these receipts back after he files the access to information requests. But we do know some things already. We know the Prime Minister made special trips to places like Ethiopia and Senegal. When the Prime Minister goes on an international trip, that's never cheap.
And here's something that I actually couldn't believe. I saw it on our group chat that we have here, the Taxpayers Federation, and I thought you guys were making this up. It turns out Canada even brought in Celine Dion to put on a concert for UN bigwigs. That can't be cheap. And it also didn't work because Ireland, they've got some musicians and they had this little known band, you may not have heard of it, Todd, called U2, and they played a concert for its campaign.
Yeah, U2, yeah, they've been practicing in the garage for a little while. How in the world, if you think the contest is coming down to a battle of the bands and who can put on the best concert, and you're bringing Celine Dion and the other guy's bringing U2, how do you even think that you're going to win this thing right there?
Hey now, Celine Dion is a national treasure. She was also in Deadpool 2. I'm kind of team Celine here.
Yeah, okay. You love yourself some Celine Dion. Your heart will go on. I get it. But like U2, come on now. U2 is going to beat Celine Dion. That's how that's going to work. But in any case, listen, aside from all of that, we got to get the receipts for this.
Yeah.
James is already jumping on that. We're going to get the receipts for that Celine Dion concert because taxpayers took it on the chin for that. You know that for sure. But in the meantime, James actually, he's not even waiting. He started to dig up receipts from expenses at the UN even before this campaign started. And man, our diplomats are not living cheap there. They're not holding back. They're spending a lot of money on little things.
They really are. Canadian diplomatic staff, it turns out, based on these documents, they've handed out more than $24,000 worth of treats, like cookies and chocolates and stuff, at Canada's office at the UN headquarters in New York City. We've got the whole list on our website. It's ridiculous. It includes 392 boxes of maple cookies. Canadian taxpayers spent $4,000 on something called Peace by Chocolate. Get it? Instead of Death by Chocolate. So that's 200 boxes at $20 a pop. They also handed out 320 sets of cutlery at $3.25 each. That's more than $1,000. All this stuff is really weird. Why are we handing out gifts to a bunch of global bureaucrats at the UN?
Yeah, it leaves a real bad taste when you look at all of this. And and if you look at Canada's UN Security Council campaign website, it's all about these ideals of peacekeeping and helping folks in Africa and all of these, high ideals. But then you get down to the actual campaign and we're spending money on chocolate and cookies and big trips and bringing in Celine Dion. Like, what is this? Is this about ideals or is this about junkets? Is it swag bags or principles? It's really embarrassing, really, because if diplomats at the UN are swayed by all of this nonsense rather than the actual merit of diplomatic policies, they should be embarrassed. This whole thing has been silly from the start. Stay tuned on this one because we're going to be digging into the rest of the bills. It's going to take a while because access to information requests they go slow. You got to grind them through the bureaucracy there. But we're going to dig this stuff up because we're going to hold the government accountable on this. They wasted a lot of our money on nonsense. We're going to send the Prime Minister a real clear message. You need to focus on the actual work at hand instead of nonsense on the international stage. So stay tuned in the coming weeks. We're going to have more on this.
Thanks for listening to the Canadian Taxpayers Podcast. We hope you like the show.
Yeah, and thanks to James Wood for once again editing the show and for digging up that list of goodies that the diplomats at the UN were handing out. I got a feeling they're going to get to know James Wood pretty well because he's filing a lot more access to information requests. They're going to get to know him. But for all of you, thanks so much for listening. Please subscribe to the show. Don't just listen. Subscribe. Let's get to know each other. Talk to you again next week.
Hi, I'm Scott Hennig, President of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. If you've got another minute, I'd like to ask you to think about the one person you know that would really enjoy listening to this podcast. Do us a favor and do them a favor and send them a quick note to let them know about it. At the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we believe there is power in numbers. That's why we've worked so hard to build an army of taxpayers who are ready to push back. And we did it because people like you shared our work with that one person that they knew would really appreciate taking part. Thanks for listening, and thanks for doing your part to make Canada a better place.